Well, welcome to the program today where we're going to be looking at the 8 tips to optimize our health and healing potential. I had some individuals ask me the past few weeks, this is, we've watched so many of your presentations on YouTube, we've already heard it all, right? Well, with the literally thousands of studies that are coming out every week, there's got to be at least a couple studies every week that are of new interest that can help guide us as we make decisions about our health. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the things that I've learned actually over the last few weeks and months, not only through the clinical literature, but also what I've learned from my patients, what I've learned from them as they ask me questions that I don't know. I say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to look into it, and as I look into it, it gives me all kinds of new insights as to I can not only help them, but also help many other individuals. So let's jump right into this. There's an ancient Jewish proverb that says, "He who cherishes understanding prospers." And so we all have our ups and downs, but I guarantee you that if we cherish understanding, if we're constantly seeking guidance through new information, we are going to be far better off than we otherwise would be. And so this is a experience of learning on a day-to-day basis. So let's jump into it. Everything I'm going to be discussing with you today, in part, is referencing the new program that we're going to be offering right here in this facility, in this church complex, starting this month. In fact, on Mondays and Thursday nights of this month, we're going to be offering a program called Diabetes Undone. There's a group of 50 people that actually went through this program right here in October. And in fact, you're going to have a chance to hear a few of them talk about their experience towards the end of this presentation. It's going to be from 7 to 8:30 every evening, Mondays and Thursdays. It's 8 sessions. It's basically just 4 weeks, and then it's done. And then there's group support sessions that are going to be coming after that. But let me, before we actually get to tip number 1, let me explain the real value of this program. Everything that we will be learning in this program this month is looking at the underlying causes of disease. So some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Diabetes Undone? I don't have diabetes. I have no interest in going to a program that helps me reverse my diabetes. But the reality is that, and you'll learn today, that the underlying causes of prediabetes and diabetes are the same underlying causes of heart disease, high blood pressure, the initiation and promotion of many common cancers, as well as the number one factor that drives our risk, your risk and my risk, of Alzheimer's. Now, it's been said that the most dreaded word in healthcare is that big C word. You know what I'm talking about, that the diagnosis of cancer. But in fact, there's another word that has now surpassed that dreaded word, that dreaded C word, and that is that dreaded A word, as we're suggesting, Alzheimer's. At least individuals with cancer know who they are, and they know their family, and they can be with their family and laugh with their family and weep with their family. But somebody who goes through the final stages of Alzheimer's that can last many years don't really know who they are. They may have lucid moments, but they don't really know who they are. And the really good news here is that we now, through the latest scientific endeavors, have amassed enough understanding about what causes Alzheimer's to know how not only to prevent it, but also to reverse it if caught early enough. Even if it's been diagnosed as Alzheimer's, it's still potentially reversible if it's not allowed to persist unaddressed until the very end. And so this is very exciting. And the number one cause that drives Alzheimer's, we're going to be discussing tonight, as it relates to diabetes. The number two cause for Alzheimer's we're going to be addressing tonight as it relates to heart disease and high blood pressure and diabetes. The number 3 and 4 and 5 causes for Alzheimer's we're also going to be addressing tonight as it relates to other chronic diseases. So let's jump into the 8 tips. I have been appropriately criticized in the past talking about 8 strategies or 12 strategies and people leaving the presentation not really sure which ones of those were the 8 or the 12 strategies. That's not going to happen tonight. You're going to know exactly what those strategies are. In fact, I'm even going to post these slides in PDF format on my website tonight so that you can have access. And so don't get stressed out and try to write everything down. Take notes, but do it with calmness of spirit. Okay? One of my favorite quotations from John Wesley, who was a noted reformer in England and actually a health reformer as well, which, by the way, I was named after John Wesley because my father, as a Christian pastor, had great respect for the work of John Wesley so many years ago. But one of his favorite sayings was, though I'm always in haste, I am never in a hurry, for I never take on more work than I can go through with calmness of spirit. Boy, I wish I could do that every day. I don't know about you, but sometimes I struggle with that calmness of spirit bit. But so tip number 1, let's jump right into it. First of all, we have to develop a plan. Many of us from New Year to New Year think about New Year's resolutions, and that is in essence a plan. But there's certain key ingredients to a plan that we need to be very careful about. We need to be very intentional about, because if we're not, it's really not a good plan. So it's incredibly important that we first know what we want, we set our goals, we figure out how to get it. That's a critical part of this. We can have great goals, but if we're really unsure how to accomplish it, what are the objectives necessary to get to that end point, we're going to fail at reaching that goal. And then it's really critical that we follow our plan and not our feelings. How many of you remember, in fact, it's recently been on air again, that Sprite commercial that says, follow your thirst? Probably some of the worst advice ever given on TV. Okay? Because if we followed our thirst in every area of our lives, guess where we'd end up? We wouldn't be married anymore. We would have horrible health. We would be entirely dysfunctional in every way possible. So every sane and functional individual has to have an approach where they say no to some things and they say yes to other things. It's been said that we have to learn how to say no to things that we really want to do in order to say yes to the very best of things. So we have to develop our plan and do it effectively. Now, there's many strategies in doing so, and that begins with being positive and thinking good thoughts and finding an awareness of hope. That's what I'm hoping to share with you today, is a realization that you actually can get better. That regardless of how things are stacked up against you, regardless of your diagnosis, regardless of how bad it seems, and so how hopeless it may be to you or to others around you, or even to your team of healthcare professionals, there is always hope if you're willing to dig in deep and not give up. And so so there's various things that we want to look at, and I want to just say outright that if you're looking for more comprehensive information on the tips that we're going to be sharing today, along with hundreds of other tips, these come from my book, Hello Healthy, Strategies to Reach Your Full Health and Wellness Potential, and also the book, Goodbye Diabetes. So I'm going to be sharing you information out of those books today. Now, how many of you have seen this Facebook post or YouTube post in the last few months, in the last 4 or 5 months? Only one person? Okay, you got to get on Facebook, maybe a few more. Maybe I'll remind you here. And all you got to do is Google how she got rid of her hunchback or Granny got her spine back. Okay, if you Google those terms, you'll see this Facebook post and the YouTube post on this. Now, this is a real interesting story. You can tell by looking at this picture from the New York Post that this lady, this 86-year-old lady, had serious medical problems. She had horrible hunchback. She had horrible scoliosis, complicated by osteoporosis, and significant problems with spinal stenosis. Herniated disc, you name it. And about in 2014 rather, she decided to go visit her family in South Carolina. She's a lifelong New Yorker. So she goes to South Carolina to spend some time with her children, and while there, she nearly collapses walking upstairs because of a severe pain in her back and in her legs. She now has to be in a wheelchair, and as weeks and now months go by, she decides that she's not going to give up, and so she starts talking to people to get information. What can I do? What can I do to get better? I'm not going to give up. I'm not just going to take the word, well, you know, you're so bad. Most people in this situation never get better. Well, the reality is that most individuals with any medical condition never get better. But that has nothing to do with whether or not you can actually improve your health or reverse that condition. See, the norm that people don't get better doesn't mean that that applies to you, because if the normal individual is not addressing the underlying causes of their condition, of course they're not going to get better. So that's the trick. That's really the question that we should be asking, and what really is the underlying focus of these 8 tips I'm going to be sharing with you is, what are the things that underlie my current health risk? And we're all different. We all come from varying in different genetic stock. We all have lived in different environments. We all have different risks that we bring to the table, and therefore we can't just rely on what worked or didn't work for somebody else, because that may not apply to us. So she decided to stop feeling bad for herself and just figure it out. And that's what she did. She ended up working with a health professional, a therapist, that had scoliosis herself for many, many years, since a teenager, and she'd learned through trial and error and great interest in her part as a health professional therapist what worked for scoliosis and these type of conditions. And so this 85-year-old granny decided that she was going to hire this therapist to come to her house once a week for 2 years. See, getting better isn't necessarily easy, but many times it's possible, even though it's not considered to be possible. Well, here we have a picture of her 2 years after initiating her significant effort into addressing her problem. Look at that lady, 2 years older now, able to stand up straight because of the considerable effort that she put into it. in addressing the causes of the problem rather than just her concern about it. Okay, so that leads us then to tip number 2, and that is resist sarcopenia. Now, I get in trouble once in a while when I use these medical terms, but I do it kind of with a smile on my face, because sarcopenia is nothing more than puny muscle disease. It's sarcopenia, sarco means muscle, penia means small. And that doesn't mean if you're small and petite, you're out of luck. What this means is that for you, for your body type, if you are losing muscle, if your muscle is atrophying, then you are in trouble. In fact, this may actually be one of the most important assessment criteria that you can have evaluated this year. Evaluate your actual strength, the size and the strength of your muscles. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, come on, that's just for the jocks. You know, muscle size, muscle strength has nothing to do with real health, okay, unless you're playing football or basketball or you're lifting weights, etc. And I would like to counter that by saying, if you allow your muscle mass and your muscle strength to decay, that will be directly proportional in time with the decay and the atrophy of every organ in your body, including your brain. And so senility, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So bad things happen when we're not fit. That's the bottom line. If we're not taking care of or on a rational, I'm not talking about preparing for marathons necessarily, unless you're really into that. I did that, and I'm done with it. I enjoy other things instead of marathons. But if you're fit enough to work out and prepare for a marathon, go for it. I'm talking about just rational fitness goals for everyone, that everyone can take advantage of. Use it or lose it, you've heard. But I'm suggesting that if we don't use our muscles on a regular daily basis appropriately, that we're actually losing overall health. Every organ system, every tissue in our body is being affected negatively by not taking advantage of regular exercise. In fact, it's been said that the first physical sign associated with dementia, with early dementia, way before there's obvious indicators with memory, is actually decreasing size of your muscles. For you, as an individual. So if your muscles used to be a certain size, and now they're diminishing in size, and they're diminishing in strength, you're starting to lose strength, that is actually directly related to brain health. The good news is that we can do something about it. We can easily do something about that. I'm not saying it's going to be easy over time, but if you plan out and carve out time for exercise appropriately so your muscles start getting fitter and fitter, then that's going to bode very well for the rest of your organs as well. Strength training routines. The fittest people I know as they age have a strength training routine. In fact, I would be so bold as to suggest that as we reach certain ages, that unless we're involved in a consistent exercise program that includes some form of muscle toning, we're not going to do very well. We're not going to have great survivability after a certain age. It's not age, by the way, that gets us typically or usually. Usually it has to do with just because of our lives being so stressed, we allow our bodies to fall apart little by little, and we just assume it's normal because it's happening to everybody else around us as well. But it's still not the way it was intended to be. I want to share a quick study with you that that I first read about literally over 20 years ago. And it was a study done on a group of 90-year-old individuals, men and women, in a Jewish retirement home in New York City. And the method of the study was they were just going to evaluate their strength. You know, they'd just see how much, you know, they could bench press. They could see how much they could leg press, and do different simple exercises that weren't going to put them at risk. And they actually measured the size of their thigh, the size of their calf, the size of their biceps and upper arms, forearms, etc., and put them on a exercise program for 10 weeks. You know what they did? They just put them on the most basic program, 20 minutes, 3 times a week. 20 minutes, working core muscle groups 3 times a week, very, very basic, starting with their minimal level of activity. The majority of those 90-year-old individuals, you would imagine, actually use some type of support for walking, either a walker or a cane. And, you know, at the end of that 10-week period, 70% of those individuals that had previously required a cane or a walker or some type of regular support were able to just put that aside. They no longer needed that. And the key thing about using support is that not having the agility or the quick reflexes. If you catch your foot on the carpet and you lean forward, you fall. But if you have enough agility, you can just simply catch yourself. You know, one of the most dangerous things people do is walking downstairs. You know, people say, "Oh, I can't believe you skateboard. That's so dangerous." And it's actually less dangerous for me to skateboard than walking downstairs. You know, if you really think about it. And so but if you're walking downstairs and you're agile enough, you can always catch yourself if there's a little misstep. But if your muscles are weak, if you've lost that agility, now that's extremely dangerous. And you could easily fall and have a major accident. So after this 10-week study, these individuals went through another assessment. And they had their thighs measured and their calves measured, the circumference, to see had they gained any volume. Had they actually grown more muscle? Had they developed more muscle cells? And taken advantage of the muscle cells that were just not doing much. And in fact, their muscle size, on average, in these 90-year-olds, increased by 10%. But their muscle strength, on average, increased 300%. 10 weeks. So let me encourage all of us to have as part of our plan a reasonable exercise program that not only includes the aerobic cardiovascular conditioning type activity that we all hear about and is so critical for us, but also strength training, because otherwise we're going to be at risk of sarcopenia. Now, there's this term if you look at the Farlex Medical Dictionary, this term called senile involution, and essentially is defined as this: atrophy of an organ as the result of the aging process. Let's look at another definition. This is from the Mosby Medical Dictionary. It says this is the senile involution is a pattern of retrograde changes occurring with advancing age and resulting in the progressive shrinking. Remember that term, shrinking and degeneration of tissues and organs. In other words, senility does not just relate to the brain. Senility relates to shrinking of any organ system or any tissue in the body. And the interesting thing is, as I already suggested, if we allow our muscles to shrink through disuse or lack of appropriate use, lack of optimal use, we're actually speeding the shrinking of the very organ in our brain that's most critical for memory, and that's the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a little, essentially like a thumb drive at the center of the brain that handles short-term memory. And I don't know, most of us who took a biology class or went through professional training, health training, were taught that once you develop a certain amount of brain cells, that's it. You know, once you are now adult, around age 20, 25, you're not making any more brain cells. If you blow up a brain cell, that's it. You've just lost it forever. And that is actually not true. You can actually grow new brain cells, in particular in the region of the brain, the hippocampus, that relates to memory. And you know what one of the most powerful strategies is to literally growing new brain cells in that memory center? Exercise. And we'll be showing you as we go through this process more and more ways on why that works and what's so critical in helping you accomplish that. Now, as I looked at those definitions, I was not satisfied. Because, see, both of those earlier definitions focus on the aging process as if it's inevitable that this is always going to happen. Now, there's a certain inevitability at some point. But we have a misunderstanding of where that point is. And what I'd like to suggest to you is, you've heard the term that 60 is the new 40, that 70 is the new 50. That's what I'm talking about. If individuals that take the time to understand these strategies literally get to a certain age and they look 30 years younger. More importantly, they act 30, 40 years younger than they really are. So, basically, as I was thinking about this last night, I came up with a new term. I had to look it up to make sure it wasn't already taken, and apparently it's not. And so that's called salupenia. Now, if you look at the Latin salu, or even in Spanish, that's the term for health. Salud is health. And what's pena? Small, or something that has regressed, has gotten smaller. And so we're essentially losing our health through this degeneration of every system in our body. So salupenia is, I was going to actually initially, I called it somapenia, but that's already taken. Somatopenia, that's already taken. When growth hormone drops, it's called somatopenia. And it's interesting that growth hormone is critical to this whole process. So every tip, by the way, every tip that I'm going to be suggesting to you tonight actually indirectly helps your body put out more growth hormone. You see, without the appropriate amount of growth hormone, there's no growth. That's why it's called growth hormone. Without the appropriate amount of many hormones, we cannot have healthy organ systems or tissues. So, in fact, just recently, I had the privilege a few months ago to spend 3 days training with Dr. Del Bredesen, who is widely considered now to be the world's leading neurologist in the field of reversing cognitive dysfunction of Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. And yes, we use the term reversing, especially if caught early enough. He has shown in over 100 patients now that he has studied over the last 4 years that 100% of individuals with subjective cognitive impairment can completely reverse it within 3 to 6 months. He has shown that individuals with mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's, 88% are able to reverse it functionally. In other words, The whole point of dementia is how it affects us functionally, right? How it affects our life in so many different ways. And he can functionally reverse that in 88% of individuals. Now, the trick here is understanding the 5 main categories that relate to the underlying triggers of driving this senility of the brain, this breakdown of cells in the brain, and in particular initially in the memory centers, the hippocampal centers of the brain, that literally cause over 1,000 neurons in the hippocampus, this little thumb drive in the middle of the brain, die every day after a certain age. 1,000 or more dying every day. How long can we sustain that? We can actually reverse that, where instead of 1,000 dying, 1,000 are being built. Okay? But that requires an understanding of all the things that either impair that function or promote that function, and have an aggressive plan to deal with all of them. He actually, Dr. Bredesen, sent all of us who did the training a spreadsheet with all the things that he wants to see that we can then, that we write in to, and then send back to his center, so that we can get back a 12-page health risk assessment of what needs to be done for that individual based on that individual's biomarkers to help them reverse their dementia. There's over 100 things that he's looking at. He said, I've had patients say to me, says, well, doc, that's crazy. I'm not going to, that's like having to take a class in college. Getting 100 things checked off. I don't have time for that. When you break it down to 2 or 3 things, give me a call and I'll do that. And he says, well, this isn't up to me. This is up to Alzheimer's. Unless we're willing to address the majority of the factors that lead to disease, any chronic disease, it's not going to get better. It might get better a little bit, but not enough to get us to that tipping point at which we're actually able to become healthier, right? It's about tips to optimize our health and healing potential. Not just to feel better about ourselves that I'm doing something, but actually be healthier. Actually be healing rather than breaking down. So the sarcopenia then is defined, as I define it at least. I just wrote this last night. System-wide shrinking and degeneration of tissues and organs associated with chronic exposure to biologic irritants, toxins of any kind, etc., and we'll get to that in a minute. Inadequate nutrients. See, we think, we're eating a standard American diet. That's a lot of food, right? In fact, we're getting too much food, so we can't have a deficiency of nutrients if we're getting all this food. We need to cut back on food. And therein lies the greatest deception with regards to diet and health. If you're not healthy eating a lot of a certain food, how can you possibly be healthy eating less of it? Now, I know there's some nuances there, but hear my logic. Okay? In other words, if you're not getting enough of the right nutrients from eating a lot of certain foods, just simply cutting back on that is actually going to make you more deficient. In other words, how you choose to adjust your diet to lose weight, for instance, might be very effective initially in helping you lose weight, but it is so damaging to the body because now you're getting 1/3 of the nutrients you used to be getting that you are already deficient in the first place. You see, so we need to have a formulation that addresses how we limit our exposure to the irritants, the toxins, right, which is not easily done, but can be done, and at the same time, increasing our exposure to the nutrients. It's unfortunate that most of the toxins we're exposed to in some way or fashion come through the food supply. So that's why what we eat is so critically important in this case. And then finally, this degeneration, this shrinking of tissues system-wide is associated with less than optimal stimulation or activation. We've already been dealing with the sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is essentially an example of that third factor. If we are not stimulating or activating our muscles appropriately, they're going to atrophy. Pure and simple. The other example of stimulating or activating factors comes in hormones. Dr. Bredesen just recently published a medical journal article on the relationship between hormone balancing and brain health. And he suggested to us that we should be checking the pregnenolone and DHEA sulfate levels and estrogen and testosterone levels and progesterone levels in all of our patients. Why? Because those hormones are critical in optimizing, stimulating, activating, healing the brain and other organs as well. But the brain is the one organ that we can't do without in particular. So that's a really critical factor. Now there's another hormone-like substance that's actually released in the brain that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. This substance is so important because it literally helps heal brain cells, memory cells, that are damaged and are so damaged they're actually being slated for programmed cell death. Programmed cell death is called apoptosis, where once a cell gets to a certain point, the body recognizes that we got to get rid of this or it's going to lead to an inflammatory response. So they get rid of it. They get rid of that cell and hope that the body is able to produce more to replace that. But if nothing changes, or if we start getting less and less of the good things and more of the bad things, the irritants, well, what happened is more and more of those cells will die in the same way, and it will become damaged, and then they have to be removed from the body. So rather than remove it from the body, why not heal it? And various hormones, including this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, help heal it. Now, guess what one of the most powerful strategies is in helping the brain produce abundant amounts of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor? Exercise. Exercise is so critical for many reasons. In fact, some researchers are showing that just doing isometrics, just pushing down like this, and then doing it again, just different isometrics throughout the body done for 7 minutes in the morning and at night can actually demonstrate an increase of volume size. That means you're making more memory cells in your hippocampus of the brain. Just doing isometrics. Now, I believe that any form of toning exercise is going to optimize that. Now, just in case you're thinking, man, this is getting a little weird, this is getting a little bit sci-fi, one of the things that we actually measure in patients, in fact, I even give my patients a letter written by one of the top radiologists at UCLA Medical Center that helps their family physician or internal medicine physician or even possibly neurologist order an MRI that includes volumetrics. In other words, this MRI is not just looking at the brain and seeing if there's any damage, but it's actually looking at the size of each region of the brain, including that memory center, the hippocampus, to see how that size relates to what it should be for that size of a person. And the great news is that we can see the hippocampus grow dramatically in just 6 months. And that means a lot of brain cells are being built and laid down in that area, but that will only happen if we're doing enough of the strategies. Okay. So this brings up the whole point, and you've seen this slide many times, of we need to pay attention to not just one or two or three factors, but we need to pay attention to our entire exposome. Our exposome is everything that we do, everything that we are exposed to, everything that we eat, drink, think, and do. That's our exposome. An exposome, by definition, is all the things that have an influence, and in this case it becomes a physiologic, a chemical influence on stimulating our genes to either activate them in the right direction or to activate them in the wrong direction. Are we activating the amyloid precursor protein in the brain to make more amyloid plaque? Or are we stimulating it, that very same gene and enzyme system, with the same substrates available to it, rather than making amyloid plaque, actually making nutrients that heal the brain? What is the determining factor in that? And it's largely been experienced in research that inflammation, any form of inflammation, drives that process. Now, I mentioned earlier that everything I'm talking about tonight is in a small way showcasing the type of things that you can learn and accomplish by going through a comprehensive lifestyle medicine program that's called Diabetes Undone, but can do much more than diabetes. The reason we call it Diabetes Undone, because that's the pinnacle. If you can, if you can effectively undo diabetes, you're essentially undoing the vast majority of the factors that are driving other conditions far worse than diabetes itself. So, all right, so let's jump to tip number 3. We need to learn how to guard our genome. It's, I was just talking to a physician acquaintance of mine. We talk on the phone from time to time. He had a stroke some years ago and has some dementia because of it. And he was very articulate, very educated. He has 2 doctoral degrees and 2 master's degrees, and a very articulate man. And he said to me, I could tell that he was fishing for a word, and he was fishing for the word lifestyle, but instead he used the term lifescape. And I thought about it for a second. I said, that's brilliant. And sometimes when we can't remember a word, that's an opportunity. That's an opportunity to think about it in a different way. And as I contemplated that, I just talked with him a few days ago, I remember thinking, I got to write this down so I don't forget it. And I actually had to think about it for a while before I got it back. But then, so lifescape is essentially or healthscape is the landscape of your internal milieu. It's stepping back and asking and looking at the landscape of our health, of our biology, of our biomarkers, and say, hey, what can I learn by looking at this healthscape? And I'd like to suggest to you that each of us do a Google Earth search on ourselves. Have you ever done a Google Earth search? Look at look where your house is, look where your friend's house is, or a pen pal in Africa, and you can just go through Google Earth and actually see the houses, in any region, essentially, of the world using satellite technology. So what about doing an in-depth review, kind of a somatic Google Earth of our own system? And I believe that one of the most valuable Google Earth strategies for looking at our own personal risk factors is to actually do a saliva test through 23andme.com. You may have seen commercials about this, and usually it's talking about ancestral information. I actually did this test many years ago, and I didn't even look at my ancestry until about a month ago. The reason I did the 23andMe is not to find out it was mainly Northern European. I already kind of knew that, okay? I was very proud of the fact initially that I had American Indian in me. Until I did the 23andMe test, I had 0 American Indian in it, even though I have the documents from my family history that I have American Indian heritage. So I can't brag about that anymore. But this test gives us an in-depth understanding about our actual genetic heritage as it relates to health. Let me just show you some examples of this. It was the Professor Marcus Pembry from the Institute of Child Health in London who coined this term. He says, we are guardians of our genome. Or are we? In other words, are we actually taking advantage of the information we have now ever since 2003 when the Human Genome Project was completed by scientists right here in San Diego? We now, by doing genomic evaluations on ourselves, can understand our most basic risk factors. And so let me just share with you a couple of studies that reference this. Now, there was a study done a few years ago by the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Every 10 years during the census, they do these studies. And in this case, in 2002, they took blood samples of over 2,000 adults. Those who had the highest concentration of persistent organic pollutants, POPs, were 38 times more likely to have diabetes. Now, when I first read that, I read it real quickly. I'm thinking 38%. Right? So if there's a 38% greater risk of you developing diabetes, that is clinically relevant. We're not talking about 38%. Okay? We're not talking about 0.38. We're not even talking about 1.38. We're talking about 38.0. We're talking about a huge risk associated with diabetes, and if it causes diabetes, you better believe it's going to be causing a lot of other problems too. Because, see, toxins are well understood to be one of the main risk factors for not only diabetes, but autoimmune diseases of all kinds, cancers of all kinds, heart disease, strokes, high blood. Basically, everything that is lifestyle related also has a component coming from toxins. So the researchers went on to explain that even those with less than average levels of toxins in their blood were still 14 times more likely to have diabetes than those with undetectable levels. Now, this last part really got me, and that is obesity, which is most people, when they think of diabetes, say, well, if I just got rid of my weight, I'd be fine. And that is actually not true. Number one, I've helped people reverse their diabetes when they haven't even lost 1 pound and they were obese. So in other words, losing weight is not required to reverse diabetes, and never is excess weight or obesity required to develop diabetes. Okay? Now, they are related, but these studies and others suggest that's not the real key issue. there's an underlying factor. It's not just about weight loss. It's about what the toxins we're exposed to, and are we getting enough of the right nutrients, irrespective of calories. Okay, so obesity was a risk factor for diabetes only if they had blood concentrations of pollutants above a certain level. There was no association between obesity and diabetes among those with non-detectable levels of toxins. Okay, so that gives us something to think about. And the reason I put this in is because now we have an opportunity to see how sensitive are we to toxins? How sensitive are we to other factors in our lifestyle? And that's the value of genomic testing. So just recently I had a gentleman, I'll call him Gus. He and his wife basically called me, and they set up a Skype appointment because they lived in Texas, and they wanted to see if I could help them with Gus's new diagnosis of early Alzheimer's. Now, I've talked enough now with individuals with diagnosed mild cognitive impairment and diagnosed early Alzheimer's, and if they didn't tell you they had cognitive impairment, dementia, early Alzheimer's, you wouldn't know it unless you do significant testing with them. It's only in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's or the moderate to advanced stages of Alzheimer's where you really know it unless you're living with them all the time, unless you recognize the repetition of stories, etc. So just sitting across the table with these individuals, many times very articulate, can answer all your questions, but then every once in a while you see a little bit of the confusion come. And most of us, just chalk that up to, that happens. But in other words, they were eager to do something about it now and not let this progress. So one of the things that he had already done is ordered the 23andMe. It takes about 6 weeks to get it back. And as you can see here, the pony gene, I call it the pony gene, PON1. The pony gene is if you go to the right side, the final column, you'll see that it's darkened. It's actually red. A red highlight or a double plus means that there is a mutated copy of that gene that comes from both mother and father. That's the double positive homozygous mutation, in this case, to the pony gene. Well, the pony gene has been recognized for some years now as being one of the most significant genes that relates to our ability to break down pesticides. Heard about recently on the news that there was a family that some pesticides had been sprayed under the house, and the whole almost all the family died. And they came to determine that somebody had sprayed water. That was the explanation. I don't understand the mechanism. Somebody had sprayed water on the pesticide that had led to volatile gases being released that then led to the demise of many family members in that household. Pesticides can have a devastating effect, especially when we're not paying attention to it. So what would I tell somebody, especially if they're already experiencing early forms of Alzheimer's, to do relative to this gene? The first advice is to become masters of our genome, we have to understand our risk. And this individual's risk is great for pesticides. He cannot break pesticides down very effectively. And so this dual formula for addressing risk by how do we limit our exposure and how do we optimize the body's ability to detoxify it with the right nutrients. See, the right nutrients are necessary now at much higher levels in order to detoxify that pesticide. So more sensitive and yet greater exposure to risk from both sides. And so this is where, following the recommendations of the Dirty Dozen, the Environmental Working Group, you can just Google Environmental Working Group, and they have information of what fruits and vegetables are called the Dirty Dozen. Those are the fruits and vegetables that have sufficient amount of pesticides sprayed on them that they can cause health concerns, especially in those at higher risk, in those with prediabetes, in those with diabetes, in those with these genetic mutations, which, by the way, are not uncommon. They're actually quite common. And so that's why it's good to know. And by the way, if you're thinking, well, I don't think I really need to worry about eating organic in that case, those, especially in those Dirty Dozen. It's more expensive. I'm probably okay. You see, chances are you're at least pre-diabetic. If you're above age 40, which most of us in this room are, there's at least a 50% chance that you're already pre-diabetic, at least. If you're between the ages of 60 and 74, there's at least 2 out of 3 of us are already pre-diabetic. And if we're over the ages of 74, it's at least 3 out of 4 of us that are pre-diabetic, which means we already are showing signs of potential toxicity. I'll show you in a little bit that one of the causes, in fact, one of the causes that, I'm an expert in diabetes, and I didn't even know about this until about 6 months ago. That's how little it's discussed in professional meetings and professional circles. And yet, once I learned about it and I started looking up studies, it was everywhere. You've experienced that, right? Once you hear about something, you start looking it up. It's like, yeah, this is everywhere. How could I have missed this for the last 50 plus years? So the studies are now showing that type 2 diabetes can actually be referred to as Alzheimer's of the pancreas, because the pancreas is becoming senile. The pancreas and the cells that make insulin are actually shrinking and atrophying, which is by definition senility. And that senility is caused by microbial infections that are chronically damaging that part of the body. So we're going to get to that here in a second. So there's this same gentleman with the dementia, looking at his report. We see right there, and see that first from the top, red or gray on this screen, gray double copy mutation. And if you go to the yellow highlight, that's the MTHFR 677. This is the gene that initiated, this gene mutation initiated the personalized care, the personalized medicine revolution. It initiated this whole genomic revolution because it was the first major mutation that was discovered that impacted the lives of up to a third of the population in a significant way. So this is not a 1 in 10,000, 1 in 1,000. This is 1 out of 3 of us have problems with these mutations. Do you want to know? And the good news is, once you know, there's things that we can do about it. This gene mutation, especially because it's a double copy, dramatically alters his ability to detoxify. In general, it powerfully alters his ability to activate certain nutrients, in particular the vitamin folate. In the activation phase is what's necessary for it to get into the brain properly and to help heal and to slow down viral replication and to repair DNA damage and so forth. So it's a critical gene, and we know how to bypass this mutation by simply giving the right types of nutrients to optimize it. And then finally, in this individual, if you look at the third yellow copy from the top, that's a single copy mutation, and come back to the left. You see, this is the ApoE epsilon 4. This individual who already has signs and a diagnosis of early Alzheimer's actually has one copy of the main Alzheimer's mutation. There's 2.5 pages in this report just on Alzheimer's. And this gene right here, the ApoE4, is more important than all the rest. It's because just having one copy of that mutation increases the risk of Alzheimer's 500%. 2 copies, and I run into 2-copy patients every week. 2 copies increases the risk over 1,200%. Here's the good news, though. That risk factor is largely reversible, depending on what we do about it. I had dinner with a lady at the Alzheimer's conference who had a double-copy ApoE4 mutation, had been diagnosed with early Alzheimer's, was planning to kill herself, and finally she said, you know what? Just like Granny who got her spine back, she said, I'm not going to give up. I'm not just going to lay down on this one. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to figure this out. And she actually figured it out even without healthcare professional support. This was before Dr. Bredesen and so forth. And she was able to reverse her Alzheimer's by paying attention to the literature that's already available and helping reverse chronic disease. Okay, tip number 4. Get tested for insulin resistance. Chances are you have it. I already said that most of us have prediabetes. The reality is, though, is that even if your blood sugars are 100% perfect, chances are, even then, you still have insulin resistance. I've done these tests on every patient that's willing to do it, and that's 99% for the last almost 30 years now. And the tests that I'm going to show you for insulin resistance are powerful tests, and at least 80%, I would say more close to 90% of my patients have at least some level of insulin resistance, which means that they're having to produce a lot more insulin to try to control their blood sugars. And maybe they're controlling their blood sugars great, but at a cost, because all that extra insulin that is being produced actually has an impact negatively on the body. Number 1, it's one of the biggest risk factors for heart disease and strokes. Number 2, some studies say it's the number 1 risk factor, way more important than cholesterol. Number 2, it is considered the single biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's. And number 3, it is a major risk factor for cancer. And that's why, again, we're doing this Diabetes Undone program starting Monday night here to help people reverse all this risk. So you can fix it or you can't fix it if you don't know or don't think that you have it. Okay, these were large font half an hour ago, but we had to switch computers, so I apologize. So insulin resistance is the primary risk factor for diabetes and prediabetes, heart disease and stroke, high blood pressure, inflammatory diseases of all kinds, autoimmune conditions of all kinds, cancer initiation and promotion, and dementia and memory loss. So the point is that insulin resistance is the number 1 driver of most of these chronic diseases. Is like looking at an iceberg in the open ocean and seeing only the tip of the iceberg and thinking, oh, wow, that's big, but not realizing that over 90% of the ice is under the surface of the ocean. And that 90% is what is represented by this insulin resistance. So if we can reverse and combat insulin resistance, we have won the majority of the battles. And that is, again, what Diabetes Undone is all about, is reversing that. So the strategies that reverse diabetes, and diabetes also reverse all forms of chronic disease. Now, let me do a quick case study here. Mark, we'll call him Mark, came in to me on July the 24th this past year, and he said, I was having some symptoms. I was getting up frequently at night to use the restroom. I wasn't sure if it was a prostate problem or what, but I decided to go to my Kaiser doctor. My Kaiser doctor did a hemoglobin A1C test. Everybody should have that test. It's a caramelization test that measures how much sugar is literally caramelizing or glazing to the proteins throughout your body. And that's a form of pathology. That test, if the A1C is above 6.4, you have, by definition, diabetes. And his was 7.3. No question that he had diabetes. And so his doctor said, yeah, here's metformin. That's the standard medical protocol around the world if you're first diagnosed with diabetes. And he says, well, I don't want to take it. And his doctor says, well, why? You need it. And he says, well, I want to do this naturally. And his doctor, well, good doctor, he says, you know what? You're going to have this for the rest of your life. And you know, I'm just trying to help you limit your risk. And so he was a millionaire salesman, international salesman. You know, and you can't convince a millionaire salesman against their will, no matter what's at stake. So he says, well, all right, I'm going to check this out. So he refused the medication. He says he wanted to fix this. He didn't want to be branded a diabetic. Now, there's a fine line between denial, right, and fatalism, and then doing something that actually works. Okay, so I love the quote from one of my favorite authors, Norman Cousins, who says, don't deny the diagnosis, but defy the verdict. Okay, in other words, if you got diabetes, there's no way around it. You got diabetes, but that doesn't mean you have to stay diabetic. That doesn't mean you have to stay, you know, a heart patient. That doesn't mean you're going to continue to have atherosclerosis or autoimmune disease or whatever it might be. You can become undiabetic, whatever, if you address the actual cause of the problem, right? That's, as an engineer would say, that only makes sense. If you address the cause of the problem, you fix the engineering challenge. So one of the things that his Kaiser doctor did, which is rapidly getting out of common practice, unfortunately, he's measured his vitamin D level. The vitamin D level should be at least 30 to 100. His was 17. So he recognized immediately that not only had diabetes, but he had a significantly low vitamin D levels. So let's look at some of the risk factors. Studies have shown that just having low vitamin D by itself doubles your risk for Alzheimer's. It doubles your risk for diabetes. It increases risk for heart disease, for high blood pressure, for autoimmune disease. In fact, 90% of type 1 diabetics in Finland were able to, let me rephrase that. In a 10-year study of supplementing vitamin D to infants and children, they were able to decrease the incidence of type 1 diabetes in Finland by 90%. The implications, and now confirmed by many other studies, is if you optimize your level of vitamin D, your risk of autoimmune disease or inflammatory disease drops dramatically just doing that. So, tip number 5, inadequate vitamin D is normal. Don't buy in to this concept that normality equals health. It never has, and it certainly doesn't anymore. So one of the prime tenets of the protocol to reverse early Alzheimer's is that you can't be satisfied with normal lab tests, because if you are, you're not going to get better. You're going to get worse. You have to shoot for optimal in every area, and the good news is that most people can. So, out of sight, out of mind, you've heard that? Okay, in other words, test your vitamin D, because if you don't test it, you're really not going to believe it's important. I know, because I felt the same way. Because I used to believe that if I'm in the sun just at least 10, 15 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, that I'm getting all the vitamin D that I need, because I read that multiple places, and I believed it. The problem is, it's not true. I've proven that on myself and on every single patient I've tested over the last 25 years. Actually, over the last 20 years, since vitamin D became available. So recognize that you're at risk because you are. If you're not appropriately supplementing vitamin D, you're at risk. It's that simple. Okay, and then optimize your blood levels to the upper third of the reference range. Not be satisfied with just above 30 because that's a major risk factor. Okay, tip number 6. Get a 4-hour glucose tolerance test. Now, we could have 100 tips on different lab tests. We just don't have time. That's more than 8 tips, right? So we don't have time for that tonight. There's a lot more information on that. But the bottom line is that if you test your blood sugars in response to a sugar drink, 300 calories of carbohydrate, and check it every hour for 4 hours, and along with that, check your insulin levels at fasting 1 hour and 2 hours into the test, and then your cortisol, your adrenal hormone production at fasting 3 and 4 hours, that becomes the best way to assess any tendency to high or low blood sugar. It is a very effective way. I consider it one of the most, in fact, it's my go-to test to assess fatigue, adrenal fatigue, headaches. If you have high insulin production, that's one of the most common causes of migraines. Okay, it's also clearly the number one risk factor driving diabetes and prediabetes. If you have high insulin, what goes up must come down. Okay, if you have high insulin, that means your blood sugar is eventually going to come crashing down, and when that happens, people get anxious, people get headaches, people have other hormonal imbalances, because once the blood sugars drop too low, the adrenals have to make a lot of cortisol, and that extra cortisol then causes weight gain and causes stress and anxiety and even hostility in many people. It's a major way to assess diabetes and even infertility. Did you know that the number one cause of infertility is insulin resistance? It's excess insulin production that then throws hormones out of whack. So get that test done. It's an easy test to do. And now, so I had Mark, who had already been diagnosed with diabetes, do this test because I wanted to see what his insulin levels were. Now, Mark had already completely changed his diet. He had done his own research, and he and his wife had changed his diet. She wasn't about to let her millionaire salesman husband die early on her. She wanted to live for the rest of her life with him. And so by the time that he saw me, okay, he had already lost 17 pounds. And by the time he did this glucose tolerance test, he'd already reversed his diabetes. No medicines involved at all. He'd reversed his diabetes, but his blood sugars were not optimal. They weren't diabetic, okay, but they were pre-diabetic because his 2-hour glucose was 147. His 1-hour blood sugar was 181. All those measures showed that he had a kind of an advanced tendency to pre-diabetes. But if I'd done that test 3 weeks earlier, it would have been sky-high diabetic numbers. Okay, so he'd already improved dramatically, but what really caught my eyes, number one, a 1-hour blood sugar above 155 is an independent risk factor for a heart attack or stroke. And he, even after reversing his diabetes, was still high. Okay? We can't be satisfied with just reversing the diabetes. We want to reverse the whole underlying cause of that and look at his insulin levels. His fasting insulin level should be under 5. It was 27. And that was 3 weeks after reversing his diabetes. His 1-hour insulin should be at least under 30. It was 137. His 2-hour insulin production should be at least under 25. It was 47. I explained this to him, and I explained to Mark, I said, this is the number one risk factor for heart attacks, strokes, and Alzheimer's. He said, I'm not concerned about Alzheimer's. My brain works fine. I said, yeah, it does right now, but like I say, it's like wearing it down, and we want to get rid of that unnecessary toxicity factor. So he was actually kind of challenging me, which is fine. You know, patients are in charge, not me. he was challenging me the whole time saying, Doc, I can't handle this diet. He'd reversed his diabetes. I hadn't even put him on the diet. His wife had put him on the diet. I had nothing to do with his diet yet. He said, I can't handle this diet. He said, I'm losing all this weight, and I got all this energy, but, man, I love steaks. I want to get back to eating my steaks. And so he said, can I at least tell my wife I can have a steak once or twice a week? And I said, he says, well, yeah, you can tell her that. He says, but right now we don't have enough information on it. We need to know what's going on with your health a little bit more. So he said, okay, all right. So we did some more tests. And so on September 3rd, about 3 weeks after he'd already reversed his diabetes, we did additional tests on him. Look at his hemoglobin A1C, his HA1C. 6.1. What's the beginning of diabetes? 6.5. He'd reversed it from 7.3 to 6.1 between July 24 and September 3. That's how quickly he definitively reversed his diabetes on both tests, the one earlier and the one in September. But even after all that improvement that he had made, we looked at some other markers that raised a significant health concern. His CHCRP, his inflammatory marker, should be near 0, and it was 3.4. A lot of people, by the way, have 3.4, but on average, about 30% of Americans have a level around that, maybe 25%. So that's normal, right? If a fourth of Americans have that, it can't be that bad. Well, about half of Americans end up dying of heart attacks or strokes. So yeah, we don't want to be normal. So what we also found here, though, is that he had a very elevated ANA, an anti-nuclear antibody, which meant that he was producing antibodies against his own DNA. Reversible at this stage, it's not that high, okay? But what are the triggers in his case beyond where he was probably much higher a month and a half before, but we hadn't measured that at Kaiser yet. But then we looked at his ferritin, and this is, by the way, a test that doesn't get much press, but it saved the life of countless individuals but it's rarely done. It's rarely tested. He's got all the money in the world, but no one had ever offered to give him that test. We checked his iron storage protein, ferritin. It should be somewhere between 70 and 100, and his level was 1,321. And that is after roughly 2 months, or actually a month, 6 weeks, of not being on any red meat or meat at all. So I said, Mark, I think you got your answer. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you keep asking me if you can go back on red meat once or twice a week. I said, where do you think all that iron comes from? In your body, right? So he has hemochromatosis. He has a genetic condition that prevents him from breaking down that iron appropriately, and so he keeps storing more and more of it, and that could be the main cause of his early demise. Cancer, heart disease, colon cancer in particular, heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, Alzheimer's. High ferritin is a major risk factor for all that. Tip number 7, dental floss. Let me explain. There was a study done in 2013 by Dr. Clifton Bingham at Johns Hopkins University, arguably the #1 research university in the world, in the division of rheumatology. And basically the bottom line was this, is that periodontal disease, basically rotten mouth, okay, leads to being a key trigger for causing rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, now so remember the definition earlier of salupenia. One of the causes of breakdown of health, salupenia, is when we are not addressing things that we think are not that critical. It's just a cosmetic issue after all, it really isn't impacting my health in any significant way, but it may be the single most important cause of your early demise or major heart attack, diabetes risk, cancer risk, or autoimmune disease such as rheumatoid arthritis. So the literature is just filled with periodontal disease is a covert source of inflammation and chronic kidney disease. And so to breaking it down is periodontal disease increases risk of chronic kidney disease dramatically and increases the risk of cardiac death by 500% in individuals with chronic kidney disease. And chronic kidney disease also increases the risk of Alzheimer's by 500%. We're getting the picture, so we got to make sure we're taking care of our mouth. No gingivitis, no periodontal disease. The goal is to eradicate all low-grade infections, which is actually the next tip. But let me, before I give you that tip, quickly go through this case study called, what I call the rotten mouth case study. I had the privilege many years ago to spend 14 years on the island of Guam conducting lifestyle medicine programs for people all throughout Micronesia. And you might not know this, but Guam is so far west that it's actually in the Far East. Literally. Okay. In fact, if you look at the map, Guam, is right between Australia and Japan. It's in the middle of the Pacific, but if you look at where Australia is, in Japan, it's in a direct line. And so I had a privilege to help people who had serious chronic diseases and help really revolutionize the way the Guamanian people viewed diet and actually help popularize the notion that you could be healthy and that disease was not purely genetic. In fact, genetics only represents 5% of the actual risk of most chronic disease. But knowing your genetics helps you really optimize that process. So this lady came into our 6-month-long intensive lifestyle medicine program, which starts out with a 2-week, 5 hours every evening intensive. The Diabetes Undone program that we're doing here is only an hour and a half twice a week for 4 weeks, so it's a cakewalk compared to 6 weeks. But at any case, they had committed considerable time to this program, and she insisted and essentially forced her mother to join the program with her. And I could tell from day one, her mom didn't want to be there. She did not want to change her diet. She was set in her ways, but her daughter basically wasn't going to hear it, wasn't going to have it. She said, "Mom, you're doing this," and so she would just sit there politely, following her daughter's encouragements. So she was one of the least committed patients that I'd had in many, many years. And yet, listen to this case study. She wasn't committed to the process, but she was coming to the program. She was eating the food. The food was great. We had a full-time wellness chef that's cooking 100% plant-based foods in a way that was really appealing. So no matter what your tastes were, like, okay, I'm not really, ready to make major changes, but this is good food. I'm going to eat it. Okay, so everybody ate it. And she had out-of-control diabetes, out-of-control chronic kidney disease, out-of-control. She had early signs of dementia. I mean, and the more demented somebody becomes, the more hard to deal with they become. The less likely they are to follow instructions or do what you want or do even what's good for them. And so many times. And so, but she had actually told me, the daughter had told me that that her mother had horrible periodontal disease, so bad that the dentists at the Guam Seventh Adventist Clinic, which is a large multi-specialty medical center, had essentially said she had 11-millimeter pockets or worse on over 10 teeth in her mouth. If you know anything about dentistry, that's serious. Okay, so it was so bad that she had been referred to Dr. Eric Oakley, who was our periodontist specialist in the dental clinic, and he was actually going to do a surgical extraction of 11 teeth. He had all the x-rays there. It was just, she was a mess, and they just had to kind of start over on In the meantime, she's forced to join the New Start program, the intensive lifestyle medicine program. And while there, she's following the protocol because, she has to. She's she's a captive of her daughter. And while we did all the tests and we discovered what our problems were, and we got her on the right diet, the right exercise program, and we gave her specific nutrients like coenzyme Q10 and alpha-lipoic acid and so forth, because they fit her laboratory profile to the T. Well, 6 weeks go by in this program, and now she finally gets to the periodontist because he's so busy. He's the only one in the clinic, and he's getting ready to start the surgery on her, and as a very detailed periodontist, he redoes the x-rays, and he looks at the x-rays, and he goes like, this is the wrong patient. This is not the same patient that was here 2 months ago. And so he calls up the dentist, brings over the dentist that made the referral, and they, check and check and check. It was her. And he picks up the phone and calls me, and he goes like, Wes, what in the world has she been doing? This lady had to have 11 teeth extracted because of significant periodontal disease. It was basically way over past the point of no return, and now we don't have to do anything. What did you do? And I'm thinking, did I do something wrong? And then he said, would you allow me to write this up in a medical journal? I think with our busy schedules that never happened. But look at, there are study after study after study in the medical literature now, over 15 years later, that shows that supplemental nutrients like alpha-lipoic acid and vitamin C, and both of those, especially alpha-lipoic acid, also CoQ10, are shown to protect against bone resorption when periodontitis is present, and even protected the gum tissue itself. So, tip number 7, mental floss. Let me go through this real quick. Optimizing deep sleep by going to bed early and averaging 7 to 8 hours a night. This is critical, and let me go to this study. We know that Dr. Rudy Tanzi from Harvard, one of the top geneticist researchers in the world, especially in Alzheimer's, says that when you sleep adequately at night, it's like using mental floss. You literally are getting the gunk out of the brain. Just like when you do dental floss, you're getting the gunk out of between your teeth, that is plaque buildup and biofilm that causes damage to not only the mouth, but the entire body and the brain, as we'll see. And so the byproducts of daytime brain function must be detoxified at night, because the lymphatic system pumps the cerebral spinal fluid through the brain at night, flushing the toxins out and literally squeezing out the beta amyloid plaque. And that's a direct quote from Dr. Rudy Tanzi, top neurology professor at Harvard. Okay? So, gotta sleep in order to get proper mental floss. Now, exercise, we talked to you about the brain-derived neurotrophic factor already. And we already talked about the importance of reversing insulin resistance in this process. Okay, tip number 8. Low-grade infections have to be eradicated. And there's nothing more important than a comprehensive wellness program where we're doing all these tips and more, all the strategies that reverse inflammation, that reverse toxic input, that optimize nutrients, that lower insulin resistance in a dramatic way. That's the first step in eradicating infections, but it oftentimes by itself is not enough. In other words, do whatever it takes to get rid of infections. There's a lot of natural strategies. That's what I do. I do natural lifestyle medicine-based strategies, functional strategies to optimize the immune system. But the bottom line and the admonition here is if you have low-grade infections and you haven't adequately addressed them, they will be your undoing. I had a patient just last week who came into me who has diagnosed dementia, and he says, well, I had a hard time getting started on my protocol, which is very intensive, because I had a really bad cold and flu. including a sinus infection that's been going on for a long time. So I said, time out. We're not going to do anything else until we address this. Because this chronic sinus infection could be the main trigger of your dementia. That got his attention. Okay, and I'll show you studies showing that. So whether it's gingivitis or periodontitis or H. pylori gastric infections or candida infections or urinary tract infections, whatever it may be, if it's in a chronic loop, on and off, you have to fix that because that means your body is not where it needs to be and you're at significant risk of disease. In fact, periodontal disease is one example. All of these infections are directly related to triggering Alzheimer's. Any infection can do that. Why? Because infections always bring with them inflammation. And inflammation is the main driver of Alzheimer's. Okay, one is insulin resistance is number one, but it also promotes inflammation, which is number two. So bottom line, low-grade oral infections will stimulate production of inflammatory chemicals system-wide, including the brain. So it's not, we think, oh, it's just here, or it's just here, or it's just a toenail fungus, or whatever it might be. It's going to affect the entire body, including the brain. So germs, any microorganisms that are harmful, in dental plaque biofilm, and these are direct quotes, crosses the blood-brain barrier and can travel via peripheral nerves. So if you have an infection in your mouth or in your sinuses, that infection, that germ, can actually travel through the nerves right into your brain. It's a nice, perfect pathway to get to your brain. Okay? Or it can travel through the bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier, especially if you have a leaky blood-brain barrier, which is common. If you have digestive problems, almost guaranteed you have a leaky blood-brain barrier as well. And, of course, that's going to trigger the amyloid precursor protein activation. Okay, vitamin D real quick. Kids use, so this is one of many examples of how to activate the body's innate ability to fight infections so that we once and for all break that cycle of on and off infections in our body. Many times we didn't even know they're there because they're low grade. Okay, so just taking 1,200 units of vitamin D daily in children lowered the risk of those children getting the flu by 72% compared to the kids who did not take the full amount. Okay? And that was when vitamin D was taken between early December and March. So during those months, if your children are not getting vitamin D, you're missing out. If you're not getting vitamin D, you're missing out a major, major strategy to impact your children's risk. And then if there's another condition on top of that, like asthma, taking that low level of vitamin D actually lowered the risk of flu by 83%. Take advantage of this. And then one of the final strategies here to optimize our immune system. Just yesterday morning, I'm never stressed giving a talk, but I'm always stressed preparing for talks. Is that true for you too? Okay. So I could talk all night without being stressed at all, but getting my slides ready, especially when I had to use a different computer here in the end, that's stressful to me. And when I'm thinking about that, you know what stress does to your immune system? So I actually started feeling, it was a very busy week, I started feeling this flu coming on. Patients coming into my office with, hacking and, hey, how you doing? And so I'm thinking, okay, it's on. Okay, who's going to win? Is the flu going to win? Is that virus going to win, or am I going to win? Well, so far I've won because I've fought it to the best of my ability. And I know how to fight this, right? Because I do this with patients all the time. One of the most powerful strategies, if you're starting to come down with symptoms of a flu or a cold, or really any infection, is to get liquid vitamin D and take, as an adult, 50,000 units twice a day for 3 days. The actual formula is 1,000 units per pound body weight per day for 5 days, but I find you don't really need that much. 50,000 units, sometimes just once, takes care of it. That's how powerful it is, especially if you catch it early. So that's a key strategy, and that's not too much. I've been recommending it and doing that with all age groups for 15 plus years. Now, for children, they would have to, decrease it based on body weight, right? So that's a key strategy, and this is done according to Dr. Robert Haney, who's the vitamin D guru at Creighton University. That vitamin D is actually the key that unlocks the genetic library and helps you access the very codes that the cell uses to make the chemotherapeutic agent that is specific to the virus or the bacteria or the cancer that you are fighting. There's nothing in science better than what your body can do itself. So as we end here, I just want to once again remind you that everything that we've addressed today are basically summaries of strategies that are dealt with in depth in the Diabetes Undone program. You can actually check it out at diabetesundone.com. This is actually a program that you can do online if you want, but it's actually cheaper to do it here. And you get a lot more out of it. Plus, you get the online version at the same time if you do it here. You can watch the initial sessions by going to diabetesundone.com. The program is actually, there's no cost for coming to the group program, but the kit costs $99. The kit includes a 350-page cookbook with 90 pages of instructions of how to do this, how to follow this program, especially if you have prediabetes or diabetes. It has a 100-page workbook that walks you through goal setting and intentionality and being able to reverse or optimize your health in any way, not just a blood sugar perspective. And it has access to 40 online videos that were shot professionally and edited professionally to help you understand all the nuances of accomplishing your lifestyle medicine goals. So I want you, if you're not able to go to this program or participate in this program, tell your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors about it. I guarantee you that every other household, or actually, I guarantee you that every household that has more than 2 people in it has somebody that has problems in these areas, and they just believe that's just normal. I'm just getting older, and we're falling apart, and we're going to be at risk of heart disease, dementia, and cancer, and autoimmune disease, and there's not a thing we can do about it, and that's just simply not true. So I'll leave you with this thought that was penned by the Apostle John. He said, "Beloved, I wish above all things that you would prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers." So if you allow me, before we end tonight, I'm just going to ask a word of prayer that God would bless you in this new year, that God would give you the wisdom to make decisions about your health holistically, physically, mentally, and spiritually, that God would bless you and give you insight so that you can do the right thing for you based on your individual risk factors. And we hope in this church, this community here, that you can take advantage of programs like Diabetes Undone that can help you with those goals. Let's pray. Father, we're grateful for the book of nature that you have opened to us, that where we can learn so much about how we're so fearfully and wonderfully made. But we can also learn about how we can literally turn on the good genes and turn off the bad ones, that you have given us the opportunity to truly be masters of our genome, to take control by making good decisions about our health. And I pray, Lord, that you will be with each individual here present tonight, all those watching it on video, that you will be with all those represented, our family members around the country and the world, that you would bless them, Lord, that you would give them a sense of hope, of understanding, and the ability to optimize their health physically, emotionally, and spiritually. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. If any of you are interested,